Hello again. Welcome back, everyone, for our second session with Javier. Please go ahead, Javier.
All right, we're not wasting any time.
No.
Krishnamurti says, don't take time. All right, we're not taking any time. Okay, I went through these next four chapters, chapter 5 and chapter 9. That's what we have for today. That's a lot of material. And basically, he addresses the questions of the main themes of fear, violence, relationship, and freedom. Now that's a mouthful and a handful. You can imagine how are we going to bring them all together. Each of them is a world in itself. I mean, it would require a lot of inquiry to go into all that. Krishnamurti, of course, sees always the internal connections. As he always said, psychologically, all the problems are interrelated. And therefore, you can go from one to the other because it is a matter of they're all created by thought. So these are just manifestations of that fundamental operating system of thought that functions in duality. Essentially, it comes down to that. We might not even talk about fear or violence, but about duality in many ways, right? And yet, these are the phenomena in our lives, no? Fear, we all know it. So in a way, also sometimes I feel that Krishnamurti is just pointing our attention, calling our attention to the fact that all these phenomena are kind of portals to the inner dimension of our own consciousness, to potentially perceiving the real structure that is behind them. We're busy with pleasure, with pain and fear, but actually they're just produced by thought. But we don't see thought producing them. We just feel fear, feel pain, feel pleasure, and we don't understand the implications even of the fact that thought is creating all this. There are, the Buddhists said something like, our thoughts of yesterday create our life of today, make our life of today. Our thoughts of today make our life of tomorrow. Our life is the creation of our mind. So Krishnamurti is taking issue with this very movement of consciousness as abstraction, as the movement of time being the foundation of our life. I think that's where he sees the fundamental human issue, that it is this question of living in time that is the very basis of division, conflict, violence, sorrow, of our limitation of our own being, of the fragmentation of our own being and the wholeness of our relationships in our lives. So there is something there to consider as the more essential element that he always will come back to that. And therefore the question of observation is also central, because it is in the seeing or not seeing where freedom will come or not. This is a matter of seeing. We are in this state because we do not see. We do not comprehend the real nature of consciousness and how it tricks itself into, how it deceives itself. We're deceiving ourselves, essentially, by living in this domain of abstraction, of self-centeredness, of division that the image necessarily creates. So that's a fundamental core, I think, of what Krishnamurti has to say. But then he picks one thing and another thing in order to say, all right, let's see if we can even comprehend or perceive the full phenomena of our lives as is happening in our daily lives. These are existential situations, existential phenomena, which are not individual to you or me, but they are universal to everyone. We can say I'm an American or European or a communist or a capitalist or whatever it is that we're Muslim or Christian or Jew, but at the end of the day, we're all in the same, psychologically, in exactly the same boat. These things become excuses, become escapes, as a matter of fact, from what we are. And this is a fundamental issue of Krishnamurti. What the teachings, he says, is a mirror of our human condition, not individually, but universally. what we human beings are behind the mask, behind the acquired identities, conditioning, content of consciousness, that the particular content is not the structure of consciousness. And we even have to go beyond that. Each particular identity will have its own particular image, but it's still an image. They're all images. That's what he is pointing to. And as long as we believe in the image, we will be separate. We will be in conflict, sorrow, we will have no relationship. Boy, is that a horrifying perspective. But isn't that what's happening in one way or another in our lives? So let's go through these four aspects that Krishnamurti presents. The question of fear, of course, in a way, logically follows from our discussion on pleasure yesterday, because they're kind of like the two sides of the same coin. With pleasure, pain, and fear form a trinity, a trilogy of our psychology. Krishnamurti called them the three active principles of consciousness. Now that gives them a lot of protagonism, doesn't it? They're the three active principles of consciousness: pleasure, pain, and fear. He puts a lot of emphasis on fear for some reason. I used to wonder, why does he keep on going about fear? I mean, he comes and goes. But no, for him, it seems to be much more central, as though consciousness, in fact, at one point, he said something to the effect that consciousness, the root of consciousness, is fear. Now, I'm still puzzling about that. And probably we might ask that question, you know, why would he go that far, that the root of consciousness is fear? Now, fear, what is fear? Fear is feeling, an emotion, a reaction. Typically, you know, the actual word, interestingly enough, when you look it up in the English dictionary, and it gives you an etymology, a reference to Old English and Germanic. It comes from a Germanic stream of the languages, and it means danger. The word itself has a root meaning, danger. So that is what fear is, really, in the animal world. It's a natural animal reaction. When we meet danger, face danger, the reaction is fear. And as everybody has said and knows by now, there are three other reactions within fear: the fight, freeze, and flight reactions. Those are reactions of fear, right? You're frozen, you fight, or you run away, right? So this is what we're doing in relation to so much, no? So you can see also, first of all, that violence would be part of fear. Is the fighting element, the defense, the protection, right? It's also the freezing. You just sort of we are paralyzed. So you're paralyzing and you run away. Fear is a movement of moving away from that which will be dangerous, right? So watch, this is as play in our lives on a daily basis. We become angry in self-defense, or we freeze on the face of attack, or we run away. It's very simple in a way, but it has massive consequences because it also depends on whether the danger is real or not. If thought is behind fear, then thought can create any phantom which will represent a danger. So we have to look into that. We may be afraid of nothing, right? So we might be fighting our own shadow. We might be running from ourselves. And we might be frozen in ourselves because we don't see that that danger is just a fiction, right? And that's what happens to many of us. We're just frozen, or we're just running away, or we're in a constant battle with that which we fear in ourselves, which is completely insane. So we see, fear is massive in its potential consequences, right? What do we fear? So we say we fear danger. We fear uncertainty. We fear loss. We fear pain. We fear violence because it causes pain. And yet fear is behind violence. Interesting. We fear all these kinds of things. But psychologically, which is where Kay wants to take it, because the animal has his own fears and has his own reactions, and he will carry on. Kay used to describe, in fact, his own fear, biological fear, when he walked in the forest. And one time he saw a bear, ran into a mother bear with its cubs. So you know what mother bears do when they have cubs and they meet Krishnamurti or any other stupid monkey coming into their forest. So there's Krishnamurti suddenly froze. Krishnamurti froze. But then in that frozenness, the bear realized there was no danger on his part. And so the bear stopped being afraid and therefore not violent, not defensive. And then Krishnamurti walked away. So, all right, but Krishnamurti had to freeze. Even Krishnamurti, even the Buddha, in the face of if he was the Buddha, in the face of danger, has to freeze or run or fight. So we're talking about something extremely natural because it's a matter of biological intelligence, biological sensitivity, natural response. Now, when we look at ourselves and what we're afraid of, fear psychologically is a projection, fundamentally, isn't it? Is a projection into the future. So in fact, it's intimately bound to the future. It is what we hope for and might not happen, and what the danger that we probably meet and that is likely to happen is a probability and a danger, a threat to that which we hold dear, which we want, that we expect, right? So we are afraid of losing our security, essentially. My house, my little bank account, my wife, my books. I don't even want the fire to come into my house and burn my books. See what we're attached to. We're afraid to lose that which we're attached to, on which our happiness depends, and so on and so forth, right? That's mostly what we fear. That would be pain, and so on. We fear uncertainty. Okay, even defined it as fear is the movement between uncertainty and uncertainty. Right? Well, fear is actually the projection of uncertainty, which threatens certainty. Yeah? Now, one of the most fundamental fears for all of us is the fear of death. I don't know if we ever met it. See, it's so fundamental, right? It's like I used to think it looks like it's almost inbuilt in the very nature of life. I can imagine the first little unicellular organism being afraid in this biological sense, because to live is to live dangerously. Life is dangerous. This is amazing, no? Danger is inbuilt in life, and therefore if fear is the response to danger, fear is inbuilt in life. I don't know who would argue that way, but let's say that is how it's happening, right? Because it has to protect itself, and therefore the self-protective mechanism is inbuilt in it. The amoeba doesn't have fear like us, not so panic fear or anything like that, but it will sort of still have a tremor somewhere when something that threatens its existence comes along. Now, that threat to existence is called death, right? So you say the fear of death is altogether natural. But Kay says, do you fear death? Or do you fear the idea of death? He is subtle, the old boy. Do we fear the actuality of death or the associations of the word death? Now he says you can only be afraid of what you know, not of what you don't know. We don't know death. So can we be afraid of it if he's right about this thing, that we don't really fear the unknown? What we fear is to lose the known. We fear that what we don't know might threaten that which is what we call the unknown, will be a threat to what we know, where we find our security. But this is very interesting when considering whether fear in us psychologically is produced by the associations of the word death. Because if it's just produced by the word, then it's no real fear. And if death is there, we're also not afraid of it. because it's an act, it's a fact. So what's the source of fear? What's the ground of fear? See, he raises a very interesting question. Suddenly fear begins to lose its substance, its reality, its grip, because it's just produced by thought out of his own projections from the past, from his knowledge into the future by association. But none of that is actual. The actual is just the words that thought creates. Fear, that way, is a kind of hallucinatory process created by thought through association, identification of an entity as moving through that experience that is imaginary. Fear is imaginary. He will say even relationship is imaginary because we're basing it on images. We lead imaginary lives. When the reading today, I was coming across that and suddenly I said, whoa, he's putting me on the spot. Oh boy, you are leading an imaginary life. You have imaginary pleasures, imaginary pains, imaginary fears, and you are yourself, as you think of yourself, just an imaginary entity. Can you be free from your images? And therefore, there might be the end of all that whole story. The story of fear, as he used to say, is very long. It has a long story, and we must be able to listen to it to the end. So he also talks about the inner story of the book of ourselves, of the book of humanity that needs to be read. And of course, it's read in our daily lives. That's where it manifests itself. Fear, as he says, is always in relation to something. But actually, the something is in relation to, and the agent that is in relation to that object are both part of the imaginary process. It's like the dreamer who sees himself in his dream. I used to wonder, why do I see myself in my dreams? Which one is it? The one who is dreamt or the dreamer? The dreamer is the dream, the dreamed. That's why he says thought, which presents itself as the projector of fear, the perceiver of fear, is the creator of fear. So fear is the observer. The thinker is fear. I never understood this. He kept repeating this thing. The observer, the thinker is fear. I said, no way. But you can see why. At least I'm going to crack some of his statements and say, okay, what do you mean? The thinker, the observer is fear. Well, right, because it is the product of thought. It's just a projection of thought, which splits itself into this thinker and whatever it projects. And he says that projection is not me, but it is me, because it is just thought. There's no observer and observed, thinker and thought. There's just thought. There's just the movement of thought. I find that very interesting if we can crack it that way, at least even intellectually, to come to that point of understanding such a statement. Because he puts it as, look, this is the key. Oh boy, if you get this one, you're free from fear. Now, would I not like that? To be free from fear. It's just such a shadow, has been such a shadow, chasing me all my life. For the love of Jesus or whoever, out. But he says, no, you cannot go anywhere with this because it's in you. It's you. It's the history of mankind. It's the nature of consciousness. See why fear, consciousness is fear? Because it is in the very structure of thought. As it has developed, perhaps it's not inherent to thought to create this delusion of a separation between the observer and the observed, the thinker and the thought, therefore separating itself from fear, and then he thinks I can do something about it. But you can't do anything about it because you are creating it. The management of fear may be necessary at certain points. If one's fear of the dark is becoming pathological, maybe you have to do some kind of therapy. Okay, I'm not saying that, but we're talking about the essential element of consciousness in which fear is so deeply ingrained. has a very profound meaning, that has a profound implications. And Krishnamurti, actually, one of the beauties I find in this exploration is that Kay says this can be seen through. This is just the creation of thought. Fear is not the overwhelming thing it seems to be, though it is when it's happening. And you have to be fear. We have to learn to be fear. That's something else that's implied in what we're saying, right? To learn to live, what he calls it, living with fear. But actually means that if your thinker is the thought, if the one who's afraid is fear, then that means living with it, means being it. That our life is fear. That we, psychologically, as these separate entities that we have built up, are inherently afraid. Not just of death, not just of the denial, but of anything that seems to deny that entity in its time-bound becoming. We're all becoming, we all want to continue, which also is an extension, if you like, of the amoeba I mentioned at the beginning. The amoeba wants to continue. So we have translated it now into the psychological domain. So thought picks up that biological construct and projects it in time. And that's where we're stuck. That's why he said thought, fear is the product of thought. Fear, thought and time are the root of fear. So it takes that, I want to touch on the fourth subject, so I'm running a bit slow. So the whole thing of fear and conflict, you see, because he says fear, of course, one of the aspects is this quality of aggressiveness. See, violence is implied, as we said, right? I'm trying to make a connection, see if I can weave a little bit of a thread through the four subjects, which proved the challenge today. But there it is, one of the threads is that there's a connection between fear and violence, fear and aggression. The animal is aggressive. You see the bear, Krishnamurti met, the mother bear was aggressive or was in an aggressive defensive positioning because he has something very precious to defend, right? Her cubs. And Krishnamurti was stepping into the area of danger, was an intruder into that safety zone. So that is part of aggression. The monkeys have it, we have it. Nationalism is just that, and all the other possessions and spaces we create ourselves for our security and becoming. The flags, the armies, all that massive construct of fear and violence. That's the structure of all those things. And it's institutionally embedded in society, right? We have to look at it in a grand way. We have to look at it in the full spectrum of how fear and violence go together and how they are so institutionally accepted by all of us. Why should we? Because that's us. And we don't see ourselves, and we don't see how we are the world and how we can change that world by dismantling the inner structure of fear and violence. Now, violence, of course, is very simple. No, it's not simple, sorry. But it is in a way just that reaction, right? From fear, protection, becoming, being something or the other. So violence can be, usually it was defined, used to be defined, right, in the dictionary as the excessive use of force. The excessive use of force. Now, okay, you may have to use force in certain situations. I used to be very careful not to use force, you see, when I was growing up. But I had an older brother, and he said, look, you're spending so much time with that. Just give it a kick. So I learned to give a kick when it was necessary, and it was not violence, right? Because I was afraid there was going to be violence, see? So no, right use, proportionate use of force in the right situation is not violence. We do have to use force. But there's the disproportion, and where does the disproportion come from, right? That would be a question. Now, because when he talks about anger, though, he wants to bring it home so that we can talk about war, right, and so on, which is a major issue, right? But it's just the violence. He says, war, what is war? War is the dramatic and bloody expression of daily life, right? So he brings it very close to home. It's just our own normal existence where all that spectacular, bloody, destructive phenomenon with all its tragedy, with all its suffering, untold suffering, that we continue to witness every day, by the way, in this monstrous way that we are, is still in our daily lives. That's where I see the connection, where I see my responsibility, and the possibility also that each and every one of us can do something about it. I may not be able, as an individual living in a particular country in a particular way, do anything about this specific conflict in a specific place between a group of people and another. But I have in myself the essence of that violence. And therefore, that's where I can work, where I can assume my full responsibility for everything that's happening in the world. What's happening in the grand scale is happening in a small scale, because it is just an expression of this self-centered movement of consciousness. That's the way to put it, right? So that violence is also me. See, it always will come to the me, and the me is everyone. It comes back to me. So daily life, one of the expressions of violence in daily life is, of course, anger. Very simple, right? You get angry about anything. Irritation, upset. What did you say? What? I mean, you can see that the face already twists even at the word anger. You know exactly what it means in a way, right? It's a bodily disposition. It's a defense. It's an attack. Something offends you. You get angry. And then we say that was righteous anger. I was right to be angry. Krishnamurti does not accept these distinctions between righteous anger and unrighteous anger. His anger is anger. And why is it there? What's the meaning of anger? What's the root of this aggressiveness? Because it's part of aggressiveness. And aggressiveness is, of course, an animal thing as well, right? So we have that biological component very much in us. But you can see that part of the anger, what anger signifies, is there is some self-interest, primarily, which is being threatened. Again, it's the question of threat. Right? So it's part of fear, the whole element of fear. Now, this is playing out, of course, in daily life, like we say, and it is in relationship, because daily life is relationship. Now, that's where we're angry. We're angry even with ourselves. Why did I do that? What's stupid of me? And so on. And you can go back to memory and retrieve some of the even bigger blames in which to be angry about. People are angry about what's happening in the world. Some of my friends are very deeply angry about the situation, elections, and all kinds of situations in which anger arises. Is anger the right response? And we say, yes, it is the right response because it's just so outrageous, totally, and so on. Righteous anger. We say it is righteous. But what is the right response to these situations? That's another question we have to face because we are in that now. This is like the Chinese said, we're living in interesting times in which there is all this confusion, these threats coming from everywhere to just simple, reasonable people who are trying to do their best. They see that the thing is degenerating into mindlessness, and that mindlessness, it only hits upon one thing, seems to be the way of mindlessness, which is conflict, antagonism, division, polarization, and conflict. It's the way of conflict. So it's the way of creating more and more threats to all of us. So people react with anger. But anger, is it the right response? Is the response of fear? And is fear the right response? Because this is an immediate issue. We have to face it by itself. We have to see through the stupidity, the ignorance that lies behind it. We might still suffer, though. But when you have immediate pain, there is not suffering. Suffering is also a projection of pain into the future. So to be so attentive, living with the facts in the moment, becomes an extraordinary discipline. That would be intelligence. You see, where would intelligence operate? This is another question. We have to bring intelligence to bear. Well, even we have to awaken it first, maybe. To awaken intelligence in such a way that we can meet every issue immediately. If time comes in as a reaction, thought comes in as a projection of fear, because we project fear. I already, in my description, describes some issues of fear. These people are going for polarization, which is going to create conflict. And that is going, if they have power, then that is going to result in oppression, injustice, and the rest. It might affect me directly or indirectly. I'm across the water, but hey, they're going to do some financial issues. They're going to have economic consequences, military consequences, God knows what other consequences. Everything, the world is a whole network. There's no escaping it. What is done in Washington reaches my little town. Who cares? I said, who cares in principle? But there you are. We're stuck together. And therefore, that raises the question of responsibility. And if you react with anger or with fear, then that won't meet the challenge. The challenge is at the deeper level. In fact, we have to see about getting rid of anger altogether, not getting rid, being free from anger altogether. Krishnamurti said something in this chapter about we have to understand. Do we see? That was the interesting. I have a son and a daughter, and he says, "Do you see?" Well, I put myself in that position as being addressed directly by the old boy. Do you see that your violence, your anger, is killing your son? That's the last thing I would think about, right? My son just came today for tea, and my question was still fresh in my mind. How am I killing my son? It's a horrible thought, even by itself. But you have to take it seriously in the sense of collectively, that's what we're doing. We're killing our children by sustaining the structure of violence in society, by maintaining these divisions of nationalism, of religion, race, and the rest. Violence is institutionalized. The most obvious evidence of that is that every country has an army. That's the institutionalization of violence at the core of the self-seeking security of society. And each of us is part of it. That army is a result of our daily lives. So the last thing I would want to do is to put my son and daughter in danger. And yet this is what society does. Not that I directly feel I'm doing that, but collectively, that's the actuality. We have a war in the making, even here. Peaceful, good old Europe, the great murderer, by the way, historically, but now at peace with itself because we've been intelligent enough to say no to nationalism and yes to federalism, which is incomplete. Everybody still want to be French and German and English, of course. So there they go, they Brexit. We're not yet sane enough to really come together and be rid of the whole structure of violence. But also we have violent people around us to the east, and it's threatening. Threats. Why are we threatening each other? See the question? It comes home indirectly. I cannot escape it. I'm in the middle. I'm living here in a swamp, but this swamp is part of a continent, and this continent has a certain political structure, economic structure, and there's somebody else on the border who says, no, I don't agree with that, or I want more land. Crazy. Why we are threatening each other and why nobody, or very few, these politicians don't talk this way, say, no, we have to work differently. We are one world. This is one earth, one humanity, one consciousness. Be done with it. No, they don't say that. They say, no, me, my country, me, mine, me, mama, me. There we go. And therefore, all of us are under that threat. We have to rise also to that challenge. But anger won't do. Because anger is precisely what's behind the violence and the fear. So we have to meet fear and anger and see if we can be free from it. Now, relationship is where it all plays out. This is all a matter of relationship. There's nothing but relationship with things, with people, with ideas. The whole thing is there. Case, that statement of case, it struck me as so simple that it might be missed, the implications, vast implications, right? That life is relationship. But do we have a relationship? If we don't, do we live? That's a bit the question, right? So he said, we don't have a relationship if, well, we said at the beginning, we relate through images, my image of myself and my image of you. And those two images have a relationship, but not us as living human beings. Now, what else do we know? Is that not the relationships we generally have? And that goes for nations, goes for religions, goes for races, goes for everything. Everybody is functioning within the domain of an image, of a concept, of an abstraction with this particular content, which is always determined by the past. There is no image without a past, no identity without a past. There's no, being without a past. Psychologically speaking, we are the past. This is also a tremendous thing. That's why Krishnamurti says, freedom from the known is really true freedom. It's not freedom from something anymore, but it's from the whole structure of consciousness itself. Right? So what is relationship? Do we have it? If it is the image, then we don't have a relationship. The image implicitly divides. Why would it? Why is always an image divisive? Now, if I think I'm this and that, then I'm already creating a bubble. That becomes the observer. So I look at everything and I measure everything because the image as the me is also measuring, is continuously comparing, right? What's more, what's less, what fits into my scheme. You can see everybody's doing this. What fits into my scheme of things, that's what I value, that's what I love. See where love goes, into that measuring of the self as to what fits into its schemes. You love yourself, essentially. That's where we're busy with. Kay even asked at the beginning of chapter 5, I think it was, if you were to be asked what really is your deepest interest, what would you say? I said, you might say this or that, but if we were honest, wouldn't we have to say that we're just interested in ourselves? That self-interest is what rules this consciousness. And love becomes just an extension of that self-interest, what we call love. We want pleasure, we want security, we want to become somebody in society, right? So that's why he said, we're all, the parents feel responsible for their children, and they bring them up to fit into a society, which is essentially the extension of these values, of the self-interest that seeks to achieve pleasure and become respectable bourgeois. He even went that far, the bourgeois, the respectable bourgeois. But that's not responsibility, because the respectable social bourgeois is the one that creates these divisions through the image and brings about conflict and war. And therefore, by being responsible for your children, you're leading them to war. So that is an extraordinary, sometimes Krishnamurti amazes me by the kind of overview that he takes of the causal system that is implied in what we seem to, take for granted in our normal daily lives. The attachment to an idea, the dependence on a memory, the desire to be somebody, the continuous comparison between what is and what should be. We take it like it's just normal everyday life. It carries on. This is what we are. But it has massive consequences. The small thing that happens in your mind and in mine, in terms of feeling and thought, in terms of wanting and not wanting, in terms of desire and action, has world consequences. It is the world. It is what the world becomes. It organizes itself and it does all kinds of things and it pretends to be or not to be. But that is there. That's what the beauty of it. In terms of understanding that you and I are the world, each of us is the world, this is part of it. The exposure to the full spectrum of consciousness and its implications in each and every one of us as the key to understanding the world as a whole. See, that will be the response to all these things that are happening, right? Or anger or fear, but the understanding of anger and fear, the understanding of what we are in relationship, how we are ruled by images, how we are driven by greed, ambition, caught in jealousy, anger, aggression, fear. which deny love, as he says, right? We all want love, but we don't know what it means to love, because we are loving within the spectrum of the image. And the image is not love because it divides. And where there's conflict, there's no love. He makes a dreadful diagnosis of our normal, ordinary human predicament. That's why he comes to the point of asking for freedom. What does it mean to be free? See, that's how I weave it. The fear, the violence, this is in relationship. We're not related. We are trapped in this structure of division and conflict that undermines and destroys love, which is what will save the world, like everybody says, right? Love is the great panacea. It will free us from everything. And you can see that even from this description, that would be right. Because love means there is no division. There's no separation between you and me. There is not this duality sustained in consciousness, and therefore the implicit fear and rivalry and aggression between one person and another. So that would wipe away the world phenomenon of violence and sorrow. He said those are the only two problems in human existence: violence and sorrow. Only two problems. We think we have many more. Economic problems, sexual problems, cultural problems. Well, there are only two, according to Kay. I thought I like that very much. I like to reduce the number if I can. There are only two. There's violence and sorrow, right? Violence produces sorrow, but of course sorrow has also other things. Let's say that sorrow includes violence, but it goes beyond it. There's a little more to sorrow, right? There's the ending of somebody else's losing someone and so on. That's not necessarily the result of violence. So those two are the major issues. And freedom, as we said, the root meaning of freedom is also love. But what does it mean, therefore? And he brings the question of love to the field again. This is what he will always do. So we will have some repetition in what we're saying here, what we're meeting here, and the challenge will always remain fundamental. He brings it to the question of perception. How do we see? How are we aware of something? Because he notices one simple thing, and we may have noticed it also, each and every one of us in our own lives, that when we see something completely, we are free from it. I like that a lot. I said, whoa, but it's a great challenge, because do we see anything completely? To be free from fear would mean to see it completely. Do we see? And he says, but he says even himself, one, fear has a long story to tell. Do we listen to it to the end? Or he uses another metaphor and says, fear is a tree with many branches and deep roots. Now, it's so deeply rooted that it's rooted at the very root of consciousness as we know it. So we would have to go to be free from fear. We would have to see through, having insight into the root of consciousness. But can consciousness see itself? This is a question that I'm not sure Krishnamurti answered very clearly. My feeling generally is that if consciousness is thought, and thought is the past, that it lacks self-awareness, that it is the past interfering in perception, in fact, that is the factor of misperception, of misunderstanding, of fragmentation. So we need a quality of perception in which thought, that's how he puts it, right? So he sometimes also asks the question, can thought be aware of itself? Bohm was going a lot that way by calling it proprioception. That the great part of our problems, I know sure of all, is that thought is just not aware of itself as it is functioning, right? That thought doesn't see what it does. It does something and says, I didn't do that. Like fear, right? Takes fear to be something independent of itself. There is a war and you say, they did it. And you don't realize that you did it. And so you fight the other poor guy, right? You are your own enemy, but you project that enmity onto someone else. Essentially, that's how it goes. See, we're all deceived in this dualistic movement of consciousness. If thought were aware of itself, that's the suggestion, it wouldn't do that. but he doesn't see it. He has an inbuilt, almost an inbuilt blindness to its own operation. So he says we have to come to the point of realizing that the interference of thought in perception is the factor of distortion, of not seeing anything as a whole. Fragmented necessarily because it's the past, and the past is inherently partial. It's blind to the fullness of anything because it is yesterday and is not now. It is now happening now, but it's yesterday. It's a very interesting issue to look into that, right? How the past, which is now, interferes with total perception of what is happening. But that's what it does. We can see this in our own prejudices, in our own ideas. All that is happening in our daily lives. We don't see anything completely. But that means also we don't see ourselves completely. We don't see the idea even that consciousness can be seen as a whole may be a challenging proposal. Very few people have ever even put that forward as far as I'm concerned, that consciousness can be viewed, perceived as a whole. Through. It's a whole. It's something, therefore, that perception can see through and therefore see its truth, its relevance, right? Intelligence has to come in. And for Krishnamurti, intelligence is not of consciousness. Intelligence is outside the field of thought. It is intelligence that can see the whole. But the first thing it sees is that thought cannot see wholly, completely. So then thought, he says, suggests, if it sees that, if that perception comes across to thought, it can be still. And in that stillness, there is perception of the whole. In that perception of the whole, there is freedom. True freedom is not from something, but it is in itself. Because freedom, he put that extraordinary phrase there at the end of the last chapter, is beyond consciousness. I'll leave us with that mysterious phrase for now, and we can go into this conversation.
Well, you covered quite a lot there.
That's good old K. He just goes to the moon and back, and one has a hard time keeping track.
So any comments, questions?
We can just be silent. We can just be silent because that's what Krishnamurti actually says is required. When the mind is silent, it can see.
Mm-hmm.
If it's busy with itself, it's blinded to its own content. But that can't be either, right? Because consciousness must be able to see itself in operation. So there has to be a silence that encompasses the noise. I think that's what he calls choiceless awareness, that somehow thought is in operation and we are able to perceive it without bringing the observer to bear on it. The observer is the one who says, this is good, this is bad. I remember Kay talking to the students when I was a student at Prokut. He says, oh, have you heard of meditation? And everybody says, yes, yes. Transcendental meditations and meditation. He said, did like this, brushed it all aside, said, you know the wrong things. He's called it wrong things. Krishnamurti didn't use the word right or wrong, but there is the word wrong things. We knew the wrong things. So he said, I'm going to tell you. So you sit down and you watch thought. But you see that thought keeps going fast. And you want to say, this is no good, this is bad. No, no, no. There's no good or bad thought. There is only thought. It arises, blooms, and dies. That's the nature of the movement of thought, of any movement. If you allow it to complete itself, see, because one thought follows fast on the footsteps of the other, and so it's a stream. That's what you call the stream of consciousness, right? Streaming. The fundamental streaming service is home. So there we have the fundamental streaming service. We don't need Netflix or anybody else. We have it in our own consciousness. It keeps going, producing one thought. You think about this, you think about that. Objects, of course, always an object somewhere, a feeling, a fear, pleasure, desire, concern, etc. The business of life, the busyness of life. So if you listen to it, one thought arises and ends, another arises and ends, until there's a point in which, because all thoughts have been allowed to end, there is no more thought. And that is attention. So look what it takes even to get to attention. But therefore, because he talks about attention as the factor of freedom, right? That when there is total attention, there is freedom from the content of whatever consciousness is dealing with, right? Because that is what allows us to perceive something as a whole, right? I called it intelligence earlier. That's how attention operates. Attention, total attention, and intelligence, in his terminology, at least as he described it in these chapters, is essentially the same. Is the operation of intelligence. What is intelligence? Is the perception of what is true or false. Or as he put it also sometimes, the perception also of the true in the false. Now, that was a mysterious phrase to me until I began to crack it also. I tried to, Krishnamurti has a lot of things to crack. And part of it is that, for example, the question of security, which he addresses very often in his teachings, because it's so fundamental, you see, security and fear go together. Right? If you look at consciousness, look at it. We will look at consciousness. I don't know if you have this perception, right? If you look at consciousness psychologically, we're talking psychologically. What does thought turn around? What is thought focused on? It's focused on security as a very primary object of its functioning. Is the search for security. But security comes with fear. So fear and security thought has this, is almost biological. It's just going like the monkey about its business. Every day to survive needs to sustain this quality of security, but comes with fear because that can go wrong. Then another pole of thinking psychologically is pleasure. And pleasure comes with pain. And another is power. Because that goes with security as well, and even with pleasure in the monkey world, of course. But it goes with security because those above supposedly have greater security than those below. So the sense of control and power is very much implicit, is a drive, another drive that thought is busy with. That's why the hierarchical principle is so deeply rooted in us, right? But attention means to see this whole movement, the essence of it, and through it. Now, security actually is necessary, but the way we go about it is mistaken, and it produces a contrary result. That's what Bohm called incoherence. Our thinking is incoherent because it proposes to achieve a result, and employs means that brings about exactly the opposite. What is Krishnamurti not describing in our psychological, as he goes into consciousness? A series of incoherences, of contradictions that, intending the good, we bring about our own destruction. But that security, that's an example of illustrating the statement of seeing the true in the false. We see that the way we pursue security is false, but the need for security is still true. Right? Like the need for love or the demand for love is true, but the way we go about it denies love. And so on. So there is a truth somewhere in the midst of all this, and then there's a falsehood built upon it. The way he goes about love is by denying what it is not. And yet love is there. The impulse to love is innate in all of us. There's something about that. So anyway, that's just to explain the operation of intelligence, which is to perceive what is true, what is false, and the true in the false. This is intelligence, and that's attention.
Miles, you have a question or comment?
Hey everyone. Um, I'm just out floating on the water and communing with nature here. It's quite beautiful. Thank you for the talk. Can you hear me okay? I'm using earbuds.
Yep.
Okay, great. Yeah, a lot of content of consciousness there. So yeah,
Anyway,
what is prior to the content? It's very interesting. There's so many threads to pull on here, but I wanted to ask you whether you know if Krishnamurti was in touch or had any conversations with Carl Jung.
uh, I don't know. I don't know if he did. There's lots of
Mm-hmm.
affinities between them, certainly, but I don't know that they
Mm-hmm.
ever had contact.
Yeah, interesting. I think it was yesterday. Archetypes came to mind, and the continuous movement of nature and this kind of noticing of the verbing of the movement happening before the noun, before it's named. And it seems to me that that's what thought does with the use of this fiction of time. It puts the cart before the horse all the time. I like to say my mind is always late to the party, period. The thought process just claims to be the one that is constructing things, that is bringing things into existence. And that points directly to the separation. And that's what thought does with the use of time. It's just quite obvious when you see that you're not that, and you see it very clearly that it just is the way the mechanical mind, and use the word mechanical, which I really like. It's how the mind does it. We could talk about probability, space, and all that stuff, that neuroscience would point to. But we get to this thing, and consciousness. When I use that term, I'm using it in not in terms of your personal consciousness or mine, but big C consciousness. Jung wrote an interesting book called Answer to Job. Now, we get to the subject of love, and then I'll end it there and let other people comment. But I found it incredibly interesting. Job, of course, was asking God, well, why do you torture me? Why all this suffering? I mean, and it's extreme, right?
Yeah.
This guy's going through hell. And in Carl Jung's book, In Answer to Job, God's response is, because I don't know what I'm doing.
God's response to Job is that.
Yeah. So Carl Jung takes this position. And, it's interesting, when he was deep into his practice, he really wasn't revealing a whole lot about his metaphysical posture. I find that with a lot of professionals. Of course, he wants to, do well in his career and be admired by his associates and et cetera, et cetera. But at the end of people's careers like that, you often see it's revealed, how metaphysical they really were. So he's saying God doesn't know what he's doing. And God is telling Job this. I'm sorry, but I don't know what I'm doing. And it's interesting because it kind of just points to the movement and the evolution of everything. So in effect, you have a backwards causation almost in a, I don't know, probably causally closed world. I'm not sure. But there's a kind of, there's a learning going on. So of course we get into determinism and all of that, and whether God, cosmic consciousness, etc., actually does know what they're doing. And of course, we render this into the known through physics and through measurement, and we think that we know it's a thing in itself. But, you know, this rendering into the known by the thought mind is something completely different than, I think, the knowing that happens before knowledge. You know, that's something completely different. Anyway, that's my comment and question, and I like to listen to people's response. Thank you.
I just wanted to say something about Job, just if you don't mind. I found that an extraordinary piece in the Bible is a document of despair, of course, which sort of when you are under God's protection, you wouldn't feel despair. But this is somebody, and I was the way the story is told is just a bit, I mean, this is a fantastic story. The God is in heaven and he's looking down on earth, and his friend Satan comes along and says, there's nobody sort of in the world who cares about you very much. He says, oh, have you seen my servant Job? He's very good. He will never, turn against me. He said, yeah, are you sure of that? Take away his property and see what happens to him. So God said, all right, I'll take his property. So Job is still okay. His donkeys and his sheep are gone, but he's all right. He said, oh, touch him more closely. Take away his family. So God kills all his children. Has I don't know how many daughters and how many sons. All gone. And Job is still not cursing God. That was the whole point. When is he going to start cursing? So then he keeps going and says, now touch him even more closely. His body. And so God said, fine, I'll give him lots of boils. So there he goes, poor old Job. He goes and ends up with all these sores and boils on his body and scraping them with a piece of, pottery. And then, of course, everybody says, aha, you are no longer in God's favor, you so virtuous and all the rest of it. So everybody shuns him. So that's also he's excluded from society, and he ends up sitting by himself in his misery, living with no property, no success, no status, no family, nothing on this dung heap. And still he's not cursing. So God says, you see? So God wins the bet. But the whole point is, at what point, to what are we attached? How are we willing to face the total loss of that on which we are basing our security, our being, our importance? Maybe even our virtues are like that. See, Krishnamurti had a very interesting paragraph. That's what reminded me of, partly, if you don't mind, I don't want to prevent others from talking, by the way, but just briefly. He talks about poverty. I don't know if you noticed that if you read through the chapters, there was one paragraph there, I don't know if it was one paragraph or two, but one part of the text in which Kay talks about poverty and talks about it very beautifully, right? Because he says sort of everybody's seeking power and position, even the monks, they are stuck in society. He takes issue with society as basically the expression of the self-centered movement for greed and power. He said even the monk is bound to society. Even though he turns away and goes into isolation, he takes his vows, you see, of poverty, chastity, and obedience, which is supposed to be humility, but it's obedience and so on. But he's still interested in power and position. He wants to be somebody within the organization. And besides that, he belongs to this group or that group. So they're still within the divisions of tradition and culture. So he's contributing to the division, and therefore he's not really wholesome in itself. But it is a poverty, he says, is actually something very beautiful. Inner poverty. To be poor within. What does that mean? To have none of these things. No greed, no ambition, no attachment, no ownership, know me. Total poverty. He said only the poor mind, the mind that is totally poor, can see what is true. Huh? Oh, I don't know if Job got there, but that would be Krishnamurti's answer to Job. In my opinion, all right? Miles is actually rowing in the water. Amazing. What a way to have a dialogue. Lovely. Under the clouds, in the middle of nature. You're in the experiment. You are in the lab, Miles. Can you see the clouds? Can you feel the water? Can you feel one with all that? Or you're still separate behind your sunglasses? Life is a beautiful challenge, no? Of what does it mean to see? What does it mean to be in contact? Huh?
Or the enjoyer of the moment.
Yeah, he also had this paragraph in this chapter somewhere of our urban civilization is preventing us from keeping in touch, being in touch with the beauty of nature.
Mm.
That love and beauty go together. And
Yeah.
neither love nor beauty have a past or a future like we do. That's why beauty is when we are not.
You know, it's interesting in nature. I have a boy and a girl as well, Javier. Mine are 18 and 22. And I would take them out in nature when they were young and say to them, you know, you wouldn't have to move a single meter from this spot for the rest of your life. And if you were really perceptive, you would be noticing something new all the time. And that's exactly it. It's the refresh rate of creation, or let's say even relationship, is just unfathomable. Our perceptive apparatus, our sense gates, of course, as the beings we are, don't allow us to be that attuned to it. But it's there. And you know, that's in the recovery community, we call this the conscious contact. And conscious contact is something that requires no effort. We don't have to produce conscious contact. It's always there. I'm speaking of big C, consciousness. And it's remarkable, you know, that's the verbing, that's the movement, that's the flow that's happening before the mind renders it into the known. You know, as the mind can understand it, which is such a trick, you know, it's a real trick. And it's actually lovely to be an animated being, you know, this collection of atoms and molecules that the action figure Miles is. It's wonderful, you know, I'm so grateful for it. But there's something other than that. That's the shared being. That's It's a lot of what you were talking about today, you know, this sense of shared beingness, of not being separate. And you know what, I think the limited amount of reading that I've done, I feel this is a theme in virtually every religious and spiritual tradition, is this idea of separation. You know, yeah, it's quite remarkable.
So I have a question. I hear about the big C and the consciousness and the divine consciousness. As far as the me consciousness is operating, can one have contact with that? That's the question. Or is it simply self-hypnosis that's being sold currently through the study of Vedanta and, you know, all the Eastern philosophy? Or I've gone through it myself. That's why I can talk about it. I was totally sold for many years, 10, 12, 14 years. I was studying it myself. But when I started listening to Kay, I realized that I was tricking myself. It's a trickster. You can have that play as a trick on you. Because that consciousness, the divine consciousness, I know Kay takes you there eventually, step by step, what he calls ground. And but as long as I'm divided, I have images, I'm conditioned, I am me consciousness, all of that is a big hoax and a trickery, nothing else to me. So I don't know if you can expand on that.
I'm not sure either. What was it? Advaita Vedanta?
Yeah. Not two, one, no dualism. There is only oneness, and you know, I'm the true consciousness, and I am that. I
Yeah.
get it. Up to certain level, I see that is another vantage point from what Kay is making you actually see what is here. And that's an idea. That's an idea. Once in a while you touch it in a way that you're in nature, or when there is silence, you know, the stillness, you feel something there. But then the thought comes in and says, I was silent. But the thought is operating no matter what. Even, you know, a second later, it will jump in and it will usurp it. It will claim it. So I don't know, you know, like when I hear that now, it just makes me wonder if it is a trickery mind is playing, or it's a romantic idea, or there's some enchantment to it.
If I might jump into that, it sounds like you're talking about spiritual bypassing, whereby you use a set of thoughts that explain away the difficulties that you have with being with what is.
What is, I will buy that, but I will not buy the super C consciousness or something, you know, so like where I cannot have any contact to it. And it's not a fact. It may be a fleeting moment. It may be a self-hypnosis. I don't know what it is. And maybe one is enchanted by it, but I don't know for sure.
I don't think there's any genuine self-discovery going on there either. if I can give it those adjectives. I mean, are you really inquiring about yourself, or are you just going off on some construct that sort of alleviates the
No,
difficulty?
I'm looking into it very closely, having been gone through that education previously, that me consciousness is operating.
Yeah, yeah.
It is.
Yeah.
And then I cannot be divided and say that I am super consciousness either. That would be a trickery for me.
Yeah. If there's,
So I see that. I
if
see
there's-
both cannot coexist, you know, the me consciousness. And that's the thing, you know, then you become either you are the me consciousness or you are the super consciousness where there's no me. So if you have obliterated that whole conditioning and whole of it, then you can say you are this, you know, supreme consciousness. But up until then, you're struggling. You are the me consciousness. Not I don't know about the struggling, but one needs to see that. I mean, I see that for myself, and I'm looking into it. That's all I'm saying.
Yeah, and I do too, until I'll call it, until the recursion stops. In other words, until thought about thought. So I have a thought and then I think about that thought. And so, and then one thing leads to another, to another, to another. And well, until there's no thought about thought, me is still around.
Kay
Yeah.
was really the word Vedanta as going beyond the Vedas, which means knowledge. So he felt he meant the ending of knowledge, which of course would fit him very well. So in India, they have no problem on calling him a Vedantist because of that, right? But of course, one thing is to have an idea of what the ending of knowledge is, and another is to actually end knowledge. And of course, you say, well, there is this truth there. But that's a belief. See, we have created a world of belief.
Belief, yeah.
Which may have something true in it, if you like. It points to something that is actual, maybe. But it's actually just a belief. It's just a thought, an abstraction again. It's just an idea. It's an image. And everybody makes up their own image. But that's not the actuality. So Kay, when he says truth is a pathless land, what's that supposed to mean? Because we want a path, and truth is a fixed point. And he said, no, it isn't. Truth has no tradition, has no abode, has no fixed point. It's a living thing.
No
So
agenda.
Huh?
No agenda.
Huh?
No agenda.
No agenda. Well, you see, so God has no agenda. You see, if to God is truth, so God has no agenda. That's why he doesn't know what he's doing. Because he's doing, you see, this is the beauty. Kay wants to bring it to that timeless point of everyday life where seeing is doing. He keeps making this phrase that perception is the action. Time doesn't come into the picture. Thought has its place, but thought has somehow managed to create a bubble, like you were saying, Dan, of this self-referential thing. The self-occupation of the mind is what keeps truth at bay. Because knowledge is constantly reinforcing itself through its own self-referential movement. This is what Kay says is basically standing between human beings and the actuality of truth. But for that, we have to understand the actuality of this movement. That's why he said, don't forget about truth. You won't find it. Be concerned with what is happening, the actuality, and why you don't see. So in a way, look at the challenge. is telling, we are blind. Learn why you're blind, and you will see. I mean, it's quite a challenge, no? The blind, becoming aware that they're blind, might see. If they see that they're blind, they will see. If they see the blindness, because it's self-imposed. Therefore, if we can have an insight into the factor of blindness, there will be perception, there will be seeing. And the seeing is that this self-occupation of the mind is basically delusional. It's a delusion of being. It presents itself as being, but actually is just an abstraction. That's why he says, our lives are imaginary. We lead imaginary lives. We are imaginary beings, not actual. The actual, we actually are afraid of facing the actuality because we insist on being something. And being something is something recognizable, that thought can measure, that thought can project, confirm. This is what we're doing constantly in even our relationships, confirming each other's images and reaffirming what we think we are. And the groups do this, and then they behave, etc. So is there a perception of that, of how I reconstruct, consciousness reconstructs consciousness? Krishnamurti wasn't very fond of the consciousness, as far as I know. He didn't talk really about consciousness with a big C. That's why he didn't talk about consciousness with a big C, because he sort of said, you will discover that dimension once you deal with the little c. Is the littleness of our lives, in fact, that has prevented that greatness that the human mind or the mind is capable of. There's a greatness, potential greatness to humanity, which is the greatness we call the later mind. In discussions with Bohm, as you know, in the ending of time, they made a distinction between consciousness and mind. And that is interesting. You see, the word consciousness means conscience. Science means knowledge. So it means the gathering of knowledge. It's the field of the known. For Krishnamurti, the very word, and the very word confirms it rather, means the field of the known. So the ending of the known, freedom from the known, is freedom from consciousness. As this self-centered movement, he cannot throw away science per se, but the knowledge that builds itself as a separate entity and assumes the nature of being. It's not being. It's only becoming. That's why thought and self only know becoming. They don't know being, because it is in the self-referential abstract movement of thought in which that image of being is confirmed. Time as a denial of being. The issue of being and time, you can see, I'm not going to go philosophical, but the issue of being and time is also central to Kane. He says you have to be concerned with this. We have to be concerned with the actuality of life as it manifests in our relationships day to day, instant to instant, and as it manifests inwardly in consciousness, develop, awaken to the blindness of the whole process, the mechanicalness of it, the conditioning, as he calls conditioning, and then see if when we have an insight into it, again, not separate yourself from it. You see, the whole key to it is no separation, is non-duality. Somebody was asking me the other day if I thought that Krishnamurti was a non-dual teacher. Okay, I don't know exactly what that means, but essentially you can say, yes, he would be along those lines, right? Of a non-duality, because he says it is the key to perception. If I bring an image to bear on something, that would interfere with seeing what that thing is. It's very simple. Normally, we don't even see that we're filtering perception through an image, through a concept, through a previously assumed notion, through the word. Krishnamurti even says, careful with the word, because the word is creating its own reality through its own associations of memory. Like we mentioned with fear. The word fear, the word of whatever, it should be death. The word death has associations of ending and threat, is the ultimate danger to us. And therefore fear is inherent to that word. But death, that thought of death is not death. In fact, he says death has a profound meaning. In fact, death, true death, the death to the known, is the fullness of living, is what allows us to live. To die to self is whole life. Not to, I was going to say life eternal, but that's a bit churchy. So I've had enough of that to last me a lifetime, having been brought up Catholic. So life eternal, well, there wasn't much of it around. We know nonetheless in our own lives that there are these moments, there have been these moments in which there has been a breakthrough past the self-referential bubble of thought and self to something else that was there and was complete, in which we were not. This is a natural phenomenon. It may be, as Krishnamurti said, the actual natural state of humanity, right? That we are in a state of mind, and that consciousness has only a limited function in the field of practical information, the valid field of science. But that there is this other field, the psyche, which is interfering. It created a fiction of being, and as long as it remains busy with that, it will miss being altogether. This is, I think, how I see the whole boy. So, okay, Vedanta, good, but we are in this field. This is where we have to work. And when that gift of otherness, like he calls it, comes in, one can only be grateful, but one cannot go to it, which is mostly what happens to us, right? When we had those experiences and we want them again. I want to live that way. Yes, of course, it's a nice desire. But you know, you can't go that way because desire itself is that very movement of thought, creating its own projections and pursuing them. So it's part of the self-referential movement. And it's only in the ending of the self-referential movement in which truth comes. That's why Kay, when people came to Kay with those experiences, he said, drop it. He said, was it genuine? Was it not genuine? You know it was genuine or not genuine. So, but drop it, but don't pursue it. The more you chase truth, the more it runs away from you. Because it's just an image. And the truth is not in the image. Look how humble. See, that's why he brings in humility, austerity, these words that are very traditional, no? Well, which philosopher today talks about austerity or humility as fundamental to our approach to wholeness? Kay does, Kay dares to bring in very old-fashioned words like humility. I'm not sure whoever says, you know, we have to be humble. The humility is almost gone from
Outdated.
You have to be aggressive, full of yourself, self-certain, assured, and assertive. Otherwise, you will not make it in this world. But he says, no, only the poor. See, almost biblical, no? The poor in spirit. Was it that in the Sermon on the Mount? I forget my Bible. The poverty of spirit, the poverty of self. So poor we are, have to be, if that is the word, internally, that we are nothing. We are nothing, therefore we have nothing. We own nothing. And it's in that nothingness, that emptiness, in which there is freedom. Because everything is conditioned. It's the nature of a thing to be conditioned. And when there is no thing, that's the freedom from conditioning. And in that, he says, there is mind, which is intelligence. So there's a different thing. He will not use C, big C, or little c, but those are terminologies. So I'm not taking issue necessarily with anything, but just that he makes a clear distinction that there is that dimension of mind. In a way, the universe is mind. There is a universal mind. It's part of the very creative, generative spirit of the sacred ground of being. Huh? There's something tremendous he's putting across as the real dimension of existence and our true human potential. But as you can see, this sounds arrogant again, because then you're projecting yourself as a great thing. Oh, get it? It's still the very little things of daily life where it all plays out, is in the immediate perception, not of distinguishing, therefore, of values, of what has more value or less value, because it's all in the perception. And the perception is of anything and everything, the small and the big, the main, everything. So it's a nothing in itself, see? The very perception that there is this beautiful, mysterious, transformative, creative power, if you like. Not power, the power is no, capacity, potential, energy, which is potentially available to each and every one of us from moment to moment. What would you seek? That's why he says that's the ending of seeking, because it is just seeing. Picasso used to say, I don't seek, I
Right.
find.
Well, speaking about this thing, he keeps calling, you have to see it, that the seeing. And what I sort of stumbled upon, if you can call it seeing, seems to me to be when I am actually being with what is. That's when seeing happens. And I'm not there. I don't exist at that point in the seeing of it. I am not there.
But as he used to say, in order to see, first you must look.
Right. Yes.
All right.
So
We'll
maybe we
proceed.
can bring our session to an end, unless there's any last urgent comment. Okay, so thank you again, Javier, for a wonderful talk
Thank
and
you.
session. We'll see you all
Thank you.
tomorrow.
Yeah, see you tomorrow, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Yeah.
Thank you.